Hi, this is Alexander Russo with The Grade. We're here to talk about covering education in April 2025. It's the third month of the Trump administration. It's the 100-day mark as well. And as far as I can tell, everything has been just as busy in April as it was in February and March. I've got a great panel here today. I'm so delighted to have them and appreciative of their time and of their insights. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and then we're going to get into the questions. Jennifer, it's great to have you here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm Jennifer Smith Richards. I work for ProPublica and I'm based in Chicago. I've been an education reporter for a pretty long time, all over the country, probably about 20 years. And a lot of the work that I do here at ProPublica is related to schools and education and student discipline.
Perfect. Lexi, it's great to see you again. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name is Alexi Cochran. I am the education reporter for The Hill. I've been doing that since around the end of 2022, and I kind of cover the whole spectrum. So national, state, local, whatever kind of pops up in the education realm. That's what I cover.
Excellent. Great to have you. Colin, tell us about yourself.
Sure. I'm Colin Binkley. I'm with the Associated Press here in Washington, D.C. I cover national education policy, including K 12 and higher ed, and a range of education issues. I've been doing that, covering education to some extent for about 15 years.
Excellent. Well, like I said, April's been a busy month. You all have been in the middle of the fray. I wanted to ask each of you what you found to be the big education story of the month, the story that got most of your attention or your readers' attention, and to say a little bit about how you picked it or why it rises to the top for you when you look back at April. Colin, let's go with you.
Sure. You probably don't want to hear about Harvard, but in higher ed, that's been consuming a lot of my time. For K 12, probably for me, DEI and civil rights have been, continue to be the primary through line, and especially the DEI certification letter, the demand from the education department that states and schools certify their compliance with civil rights laws, going after DEI policies. That's probably been the biggest, story and the one I've done most on in the last month.
And what makes it a big story for you in K 12? I know you cover both higher ed and K 12, but what made it a big story?
Yeah, it's another case where the education department seems to be, testing the boundaries a little bit on, what they can demand of schools and states, and it's another case where they are, making significant threats around, Title I funding, education money that schools rely on. So it's another area for me where, we need to see where, to what extent the education department, this administration will push these policies and whether they will follow through on these threats like they've done at some colleges and universities.
Right. And also what the courts have to say and whether the court rulings get followed. Lexi, what was the big story of April for you?
Well, like he said, Harvard was one of the big ones. I'm sure everybody's heard so much about that. I think another one that was a big story is kind of the foreign student visas. All the court cases there, the First Amendment arguments there, kind of made me feel like I was an immigration reporter for about like two weeks in April. I was like had a lot to learn, so that was probably, besides the Harvard stuff, was probably the big thing that consumed a lot of my time.
And what made that a big story for you and for the Hill?
Yeah, I think what made it, like, a big story for us is just kind of the magnitude of how quickly it ramped up, especially as it kinda, I think, became a piece of what the Trump administration is using against higher education here, and kind of how they took that and made it an immigration thing, threatened to, want to send people back to their countries, and foreign students are just such a big part of a lot of universities. So I think it was the magnitude of how quickly it happened, and also how it's kind of being used in the larger fight in higher education right now.
Right. It really made things very personal. Some of those videos were quite stunning. Jennifer, what was the big story for you and the ProPublica education folks in April?
It's interesting. It's very hard to pick out a single story that is like the big story, but I think the theme that we're starting to see at ProPublica and other news outlets is we're in a point now where we are seeing some of the actual impact of these very, significant policy changes, the guidance that's coming out, the executive orders. We're starting to see those actually trickle down, and um, we're able to now understand a little more what kind of impact they're going to have. And so, at ProPublica, we wrote about the impact of sort of the the Trump war on measurement and data, and how many places the Trump administration has ended data collections, ended studies, across the board. That's including in education. And so I think, the if I were to put a label on the stories that made the biggest impact in April, it would be stories about, consequences.
And the consequences include flesh that out a little bit for us. What are the consequences that you're starting to see and report on?
Sure. So for what I mean, when we're talking about data collection, we're able to see from the researchers themselves directly what they've stopped working on. So I spoke with researchers who had been working on studies for decades. They've been following the same cohort of people studying the effects of kindergarten, for example. And they've been checking in with the same cohort of people for decades. They're in their 40s now. And because the Institute for Education Sciences was all but wiped out by the Trump administration, that study just ended. Like it abruptly stopped. And I think having people realize, oh my gosh, we're not going to have that information anymore. We will not find a conclusion to that study. We'll get nothing more out of that, I think was really consequential. But we're also seeing in terms of consequences, um, the very significant shifts in the Office for Civil Rights. We're starting to hear much more from parents and through lawsuits that individuals are being affected by the cuts to the Office for Civil Rights and that reorienting of the mission of the office. So, starting to hear from people who are noticing on the ground in their lives the consequences of the changes that the Trump administration has made.
Right. And for folks who don't live and breathe education, the federal government is uniquely influential on measurement, and research in schools, and many other things, and also civil rights enforcement. That's a place where things can get very federal very fast, as opposed to state and local.
Right.
Excellent. One of the things I want to get a sense of is what it's like being an education reporter these days, and whether it's getting harder or easier, or you're feeling more successful or more challenged than you were in the first couple months. So I wanted to ask any or all of you about particular successes you've been having on the reporting side, reporting and publishing side, or challenges, and again, whether things are any different than February or March, to the extent that you can, the months haven't blurred altogether. Does anyone want to take a shot at successes and challenges?
I think one of the challenges, which I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, is some especially with the immigration stories I've been doing. There were a lot of kind of technical pieces within the immigration
Right.
realm that maybe I didn't know as well, and that was definitely a challenge to make sure I studied it, to make sure I was putting out the right terms in terms of the different immigration aspects. Successes, I would say what Jennifer talked about a bit is we're kind of now getting out of the more, I think, speculative era of like, okay, well, he talked about this may happen. And I think it was a little bit easier this month in terms of, actually getting to, right, this is happening. Like this isn't some, speculative thing that we don't know, what the consequences or what the policy can be. It's actually going on now. And I think that's a success from the first 2 months where it was just very kind of up in the air.
Excellent. Anyone else want to talk about they or their newsroom's successes and challenges in April?
It's kind of both sides the same coin for me, and I say it's the pace. The pace from for the last 3 months, it hasn't slowed down. Being an education reporter is always important. It's more important than ever right now, and there's news coming every single day out of the federal government. And so for us, just getting used to this pace, but also being able to quickly respond to it and to be proactive about looking at impact and finding what's coming next. I think we've been successful at that. Like Lexi's talking about, we've also been really hustling around the immigration coverage. Pretty early on, we were able to get a kind of high level story about what universities were seeing. And then, with the help of our bureaus across the country, we've been able to track individual cases and get updates on what's happening. So I think the pace is it's challenging, but we've also I think done pretty well at staying ahead of it.
Tell me, I'm glad to hear it. Tell me if you feel like it of a particular story that you feel successful about.
Sure. I think several weeks ago, I think it was probably April. I could be wrong, but the when New York was the first state to say that it was going to defy the Trump administration's order around Title VI certification in DEI. That happened late on a Friday, and I think Monday morning I was able to get in touch with a lot of different states and quickly found that Minnesota was following, and we were pretty quickly able to get a story rounding up kind of a growing momentum among some Democratic-led states to push back against this. So that was one that I think we succeeded in.
Excellent. Jennifer, do you have anything to say on successes and challenges? I'd love to hear.
Sure. So I was a beat reporter for a long time, and so I'm used to fast pace. I've done it before. This is very different, right? And it's also different when you're working for a news organization that really is focused on investigative work and deeply reported work. I think we've been successful in being as nimble as we possibly can, and breaking news when we can. But I think where we've done really well is kind of taking a step back and assessing things as a whole and looking at trends. Um, and that can be very, very hard when, as Lexi and Colin pointed out, the news is changing so rapidly. So, I mean, just to be frank, I've been working on a story now for weeks that normally in a normal pace, I would be able to have turned and be published already. But every couple of days, something happens that's consequential and that is, critical to the story. And so we've got to stop, do a little extra reporting and get that in the story. And I think that's been the single biggest challenge is that the news is changing so fast and information is coming so fast that long-term work is actually harder than it was before because the reporting it's almost like there's no endpoint to the reporting.
It's something that needs to be updated constantly or gets interrupted.
That's right.
Great. And ProPublica, of course, does deep investigative work, so it's very different what ProPublica is trying to do.
Right.
Every week, as I hope you know, those of you on the panel here and those of you watching or listening along, The Grade does a best education story of the week. It's fun and challenging to come up with contenders and then debate and decide what stories we liked. And I wanted to ask you all to play that role in terms of other newsrooms or stories or bylines that you might have seen, um, uh, partly to see what your take is, and partly also because I think it's helpful and important to appreciate each other's work and understand a little bit about what education journalists admire about others' work. So, for example, last week we spotlighted a local story with national ramifications, I thought, which was about bot students, fake students, making fake applications to community colleges in San Diego. The story was out of Voice of San Diego. The education reporter there is named Jacob McWhinney. Um, and he wasn't the first, but it was the first time it had been written about in a little while. He wrote a great story about how the community colleges in the San Diego area were being inundated with fake students who were providing stolen identity information, who were handing in work produced by AI, and about how financially and logistically it was really gumming up things. I thought it was an interesting story. It had a nice local and national angle. Um, you all are heads down working on your own stories all week. I get that. You don't have the luxury of sitting and watching the internet go by the way I do. But is there anything out there that you saw that you thought, hey, that's a good story, or I wish I'd done that, or and again, it could be a topic that you think is important. It could be a individual reporter or a newsroom that's doing good work.
2 cents here, and first make this one about Harvard, and not to continue the obsession on a single university, but the New York Times had a really good story about the kind of behind the scenes on the Trump administration's demand letter sent to Harvard, and how it may have been sent in error, kind of explaining how this kind of spiraled very quickly out of control, possibly because of a failure to communicate. I just thought it was a really deeply reported story that got to some of the mechanics behind how this all happens, and it was one that I felt like wish I would have written it.
Yeah, that was a great one. Excellent. Does anyone else have anything that's come to mind? I didn't tell you to prepare anything about this, so I apologize. But if there's something that comes to mind, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, well, Colin kind of took mine somewhat. I was thinking of the WSJ's stories. I think they had one about Columbia, which I don't know if that was actually this month or last month, but I know they had one about Harvard as well, about kind of the behind the scenes. I know the Columbia said about how the administrators were talking behind the scenes about, oh, well, some of these changes we wanted to do, so it wasn't a big deal. And I thought that was kind of like an interesting tidbit. And I think Harvard didn't have something similar, but like kind of the fight there between after that letter was sent, administrators behind the scenes being like, none of this is acceptable. We're going to go public with it. The Trump administration was saying that they didn't expect that to go public. So I just think they've had a lot of good kind of the behind the scenes stuff about these fights that I wish I could get behind a little bit more.
Excellent. Jennifer, do you have a thought on this?
I do. It's one that's fresh in my mind, and um, I think a really important topic, which is about special education and how people with disabilities are receiving some of the thoughts that RFK Jr. has been throwing out about autism in particular. And the changes that seem to be on the horizon for who will administer IDEA. So I read a story in the 74 by Beth Hawkins that I thought was a really smart take on kind of asking disability advocates and asking people with disabilities what their fears are. And it just really it had just like chunks um, of just like frank thoughts and worries from groups of people. And it was a really digestible way to like quickly understand what people with disabilities feel the stakes are as these policy changes, kind of go into motion.
Excellent. Go Beth. I'm a big fan of her work.
Yeah, it's great.
I wanted to ask you all a little bit about any concerns or misgivings or little spidey sense tingling worries you may have about the coverage. You may have whatever misgivings you have about things that people are doing out there, but um, this issue of getting behind the scenes is important. This issue of focusing, but perhaps not too much, on elite universities is important. Um, are there any things that you worry about as a education journalist, either in terms of your own work or in terms of the work that you see going on around you? Is there any glimmer of a concern about missing a story, covering it wrong, over covering a story? Is there anything out there that makes you worry a little bit in a constructive way?
And missing a story is like it's gonna happen. I think that some of us have just like accepted that we are human and we cannot get to every story because there simply are so many to tell. Um, And so that doesn't feel like a potential danger. That just is. It's just a fact. I think that just as in any other type of reporting, it's good to remind yourself that sometimes the official word and the official description of something may not always be accurate. And repeating that to yourself is especially important right now. And
Mhm.
I just want to point out like one
Mhm.
area of coverage that I've seen a little bit about, but not a ton, which is about disparate impact in discipline. So there was the executive order that the president put out that basically said the existence of disparate impact is not in itself discriminatory. And then I saw a lot of stories written about that executive order, but some of them didn't mention sort of the context of what we know through the federal government's own data collections about how disparate some discipline is. For example, in a school that has, very few black students, they may be subjected to discipline or police involvement more at much higher rates than other students. And so I would like to see stories that cover that disparate impact EO really address like what it is that we know through the data and what research has shown about whether disparate impact is indeed linked to discrimination. And I did see stories that didn't mention that at all. It just sort of repeated what was, the content of the EO.
Got it. Well, that's an important issue. Is there anything else that comes to mind from anyone else in terms of overcovered, undercovered, or miscovered? Any reflections on the past month?
Yeah, I think my biggest concern is, and I know we've talked a lot about this here, is that things are moving so fast and there's so much news that there's a lot of kind of under the surface issues that I think are really hard to get into right now because there's no break in like the top line news. Like obviously we are still contending with learning loss, there's still kind of absenteeism, students are struggling to read, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of issues that is still, bubbling under the surface here that I think is, at least for me being the only education reporter in the newsroom, it's very difficult to kind of get to those under the surface, very important issues because there's just so much top line news happening right now.
Is there any way? I think about this all the time. We've got an enrollment cliff, we've got a funding cliff, literacy, et cetera. We've got a lot of important but not particularly Washington-oriented education issues out there. Is there any activity around that a national education reporter could glom onto? Is there any way that a national education reporter could get into that stuff, or is that just unlikely to happen for now?
Um, I mean, typically, if I'm able to get into that type of stuff during a very busy news cycle, it's because there's some interest in data that came out about it that kind of brings a new aspect to it. If it does start getting talked about at the executive level, that's another way. But like, those are kind of the two main ways that I think whenever I'm like, how can I get into this, is seeing if there's some lawmaker or the president, somebody said something about it, or is there some new study that has come out that I'm like, okay, I can like pitch this as like a fresh angle to this and hopefully have the time to be like, I can get this done along with all the other top line stuff that's happening right now.
Right. Of course, it would also help if there were more people proposing education ideas out there rather than one side proposing education ideas and the other side objecting to them. We've got this. I've said this 100 times. I hope it's true in your understanding of the world as well. We don't have a lot of alternative ideas for improving American schools out there. We've just sort of got a Trump administration ideas and then the reaction to them. Colin, did you have anything on the concerns or qualms front? there's no requirement, and I didn't.
Sure, yeah, no, I'll say a couple quick things. I think one is just the nature of the timing, but I think there's going to be and there should be a lot more attention on what's happening on the Hill around education. I think especially on reconciliation, we're going to see some changes with real impact, and so getting ahead of what that could mean, I think is going to be important for us in other newsrooms. And I know this is something we all think about, but especially as a policy reporter, thinking about the impact is just always in the back of my head, and trying to move away from what's happening in Washington and show what it means for people outside of Washington. I'm not saying that that's something that's not done, but I think we can all do that and continue to do that better. So that's a goal of mine going forward. And yeah, just finding ways to show how editors, my editors say this over and over again. How does this affect kids? What does this mean for students across the country? And so always finding ways to whether it's in the first day story or in follow ups, find smart ways to look at what this means for students.
Right. There's a former education reporter named Anya Kamenetz who talks about pseudo events, and her journalistic pledge is I will not cover events that don't address real world impacts on large numbers of people. And I know you all have that in mind already. I don't know whether she invented the term or not, but she puts out a newsletter, and every week it says no pseudo events, by which she means political theater or sort of he said, she said between advocates on two different sides of an issue. She moved on to climate, so we don't get her work on education anymore. But I think it's an issue or an aspect, and I'm glad you brought it up, that we all need to attend to. You guys have been great. I want to ask you a little bit to peek into next month, to look in your crystal balls or look at your assignments and wish list ideas. Let's wrap up by talking about what May is most likely to look like, or what you already know you're going to be working on or is already coming down the pike. Does anyone have a new story or a new angle for May? Colin, you mentioned the budget reconciliation. That's obviously coming along. Is there anything else coming along that those of us who've gotten overwhelmed with or tired of the Harvard story or the DEI story can look forward to in May?
I will say I think some of my reporting and my interest is in what's going to happen next with these other sort of big functions of the U.S. Department of Education that the president is saying are going to move back to the states. So how is that going to work? How is special education administration going to work? What about Title One? So these sort of like broad issues that have been goals of moving out from under the Department of Education. I think I'd like to spend time next month reporting and understanding what that might look like and what's actually being proposed.
Excellent. Anyone else have a thought about May?
I think what I think might happen is I think we're gonna keep getting more specific in coverage, and what I mean by that is, like I said earlier, kind of February, March was a bit of like broad. Well, January and February was a bit of kind of broad. He's saying this stuff might happen. Will it happen? I feel like more March, April was like, okay, he's finally doing some things, and some things are moving here. But I think coming up in the next month or two, I think we'll get even more specific, especially as court cases progress, as those things progress. What will actually happen? Will some of this stuff actually go through? Or what are these schools going to do? Because they've been pretty quiet over the past couple of months, and we're kind of seeing that shift to, oh, we're going to fight back. I feel like it's going to become a more specific story. It's going to kind of narrow down even more from like the broad sense that we had at the beginning of this administration. Kind of my broad sense of what will be happening in the next month or so.
Do you think I'm curious, do you think it's going to become more intense or whether it's going to fade away? President Trump is known for making a big splash. I remember the building the wall. Does anyone else remember building the wall? And then moving on to something else. Is there a possibility, Lexi or anyone else, is there a possibility that he will, having made all his executive orders and sent all his letters, simply move on, and the education world will find itself sort of bruised and battered, perhaps, but basically back on its own? Or do you think that this kind of intensity and focus will continue, and people will think that April, March, and February were the easy months compared to May, June, and July?
I think there's definitely a chance of that. I mean, we've seen him do it before. I think it will be on reporters to kind of make sure that some of the stuff doesn't get pushed to the back. But also, there's some stories that might, I think, have some sort of a natural pause in terms of. I know the Harvard case. I don't think the next hearing is until July, if I'm correct. So like. I'm not sure. We can't predict how much news will happen from here to there, but there's only so much you can write until there's kind of the next step in the story, and if that doesn't come until July, there might be somewhat of a natural pause, but like you said, sometimes Trump does like to kind of make these bigger news stories and stuff gets, you know, brushed under the rug, and you want to make sure it doesn't get too brushed under the rug unless there's some sort of, I guess, natural pause in that, because I'm afraid that's some of this is these stories are big, and we'll try to get every single angle we possibly can, and you don't want to, just do it to do it. It wants to have a purpose. So
Right.
I think you want to make sure you follow the story, but also don't try to force something. There's going to be natural developments that come up here that will continue it.
Right. You don't want to write or overwrite the Massapequa school mascot story. That's not what you went to J school for, I don't think. Colin, you get the last word. You've already answered the question, mentioning the budget reconciliation, but what's your crystal ball tell you about covering education in May?
Or I don't know if this will be May or beyond, but one storyline that I'll be keeping an eye on is the issue of whether more Republican states will be asking for to block grant their federal education funding, and what that means for the flexibility that they could get around spending money that's supposed to go to particular schools or purposes. And also whether the education department will make a decision on some of those requests that we've already seen. And I know, just a separate topic, I know that a lot of the newsrooms that we collaborate with, there's a lot of interest in following what's happening with migrant students and how the administration's immigration policies are affecting attendance, daily life for these students, just big picture what it means for this large group of students across the country. So those are kind of the two topics that I think we may see some movement on.
Excellent. Fascinating. I want to thank all of you for being here. Jennifer Smith Richards from ProPublica, Lexi Lonas Cochran from The Hill, and Colin Binkley from AP. Three great education reporters working hard. We'll have links to their stories and their social media in the show notes if you don't already follow their social media, which I'm sure that you do. This has been The Grades covering education month in review for April 2025. I'm Alexander Russo from The Grade, and thank you so much for participating, and thank you so much for watching.